On November 1st, 1700, inside the massive royal Alcazar of Madrid, a king finally died. He was only 38 years old, but his body looked like a man's 3 times his age, worn out, broken, and just exhausted. His name was Charles II, King of Spain and ruler of a global empire. But in the quiet of that death chamber, none of those titles mattered. All that mattered was the question that had been haunting Europe for decades. What happens now? For years, everyone had been waiting for this. Ambassadors, spies, and rival royals had watched him, tracking the slow, agonizing decay of his body. They knew his last breath wouldn't be an end, but a beginning. The beginning of a war, of chaos, of the entire map of the world being violently redrawn. But before the armies could march, there was one last, morbid show to perform. The royal physicians, their faces grim in the flickering candlelight, sharpened their blades. An autopsy wasn't standard practice for a king, but Charles wasn't a standard king. His life had been so full of bizarre sicknesses, so warped by suffering, that his people had a chilling nickname for him: El Hechizado, the Bewitched. They had to know, was it a curse, poison, or was it something else, something much more horrifying? They were about to slice open the most powerful monarch in the world. They weren't just looking for a cause of death, they were looking for a secret, a grotesque, biological truth that would expose the darkest legacy of Europe's most powerful family and send a shockwave of horror across the continent. What they were about to find was evidence of a crime committed not against him, but by his own ancestors for generations. To understand the tragedy locked inside Charles II's body, you have to understand the magnificent, terrifying machine that was the House of Hapsburg. For centuries, they were the most dominant family in Europe. Their motto basically tells you their whole strategy for world domination: let others wage war. You, happy Austria, marry. So what was their secret weapon? Armies? Nope. Marriage contracts. They were masters of dynastic politics, weaving a web of unions that trapped entire kingdoms. It started in the 15th century and quickly snowballed. A Habsburg prince marries a Spanish princess. Their kid marries a Portuguese noble. Their grandkid marries a Bohemian royal, and on and on. They collected crowns like other people collect stamps. At their peak, the Habsburgs ruled Spain, Austria, the Netherlands, chunks of Italy, and a colonial empire so huge it was literally the empire on which the sun never set. But there was a fatal flaw baked into this brilliant strategy. To keep all that power, all those titles, and all that wealth in the family, the Habsburgs started looking inward for marriage partners. The family tree stopped branching out. Instead, it folded in on itself, tying a genetic knot that got tighter with every generation. Uncle married niece. First cousin married first cousin. This wasn't just occasional, it was policy. Over 2 centuries leading up to Charles II, the Spanish side of the family practiced this dynastic inbreeding with an almost religious devotion. Out of the 11 marriages in the Spanish Habsburg line right before Charles, 9 were between close blood relatives. The most obvious sign of this was the famous Habsburg jaw. It's a severe underbite where the lower jaw juts out so far the teeth can't meet. It came with a thick lower lip and a long nose, creating a very distinct and, as time went on, more and more severe facial deformity. You can actually see it getting worse through the centuries in their royal portraits. It's like a painted record of their own genetic decline. But the jaw was just the warning sign. It was the visible marker of an invisible poison building up in their bloodline. With every one of these marriages between relatives, the chances of inheriting 2 copies of the same rare, recessive, and often harmful gene went through the roof. The genetic diversity that normally protects us from disease was being systematically wiped out. The Habsburgs were creating a perfect storm for genetic disorders. Miscarriages and infant deaths became tragically common. Even the ones who made it to adulthood were often sickly and frail. And that brings us to the parents of Charles II. His father was King Philip IV of Spain. His mother was Mariana of Austria. Philip wasn't just older than Mariana, he was her uncle. This one marriage was the grand finale of all the inbreeding that came before it. To put it in modern terms, scientists use something called an inbreeding coefficient to measure how genetically similar 2 parents are. A child of an uncle and niece normally has a coefficient of 0.125. Charles II was a mind-boggling 0.254. That means over a quarter of his genes were identical from both sides. Genetically speaking, He was more inbred than a child born to a brother and sister. He wasn't just a king. He was a living, breathing genetic ticking time bomb. The entire Spanish Empire was resting on the shoulders of a boy whose biology was the final, catastrophic bill for centuries of dynastic pride. And from the moment he was born, it was clear that the bomb was about to go off. When Charles was born on November 6, 1661, the court wasn't filled with joy. It was filled with desperate, anxious relief. His father, Philip IV, was an old man, and all his other sons had died. The empire needed an heir, and this frail, sickly baby was their last shot. From the start, it was clear something was very wrong. The baby was weak and constantly sick. He was so fragile that he was treated less like a child and more like a priceless, paper-thin vase. He wasn't weaned off milk until he was 4 or 5 years old, which is about the same time he finally learned to walk. He didn't learn to talk until he was almost 4, and when he did, his enormous tongue and deformed jaw made it nearly impossible to understand him. He drooled constantly. Chewing was a non-starter. His teeth didn't meet at all, so he had to swallow his food whole, which gave him a lifetime of agonizing stomach problems. His appearance was shocking. He had the Hapsburg jaw, but cranked up to a terrifying degree. His head was abnormally large, a condition we now call hydrocephalus, or fluid on the brain. His body was small and weak. He had rickets, measles, rubella, smallpox. He was a walking textbook of diseases that left him weaker each time. And his mind was just as affected. He was described as being listless and apathetic, with severe intellectual disabilities. He would swing between deep, dark depressions and terrifying fits of rage. He was basically kept away from the duties of a king because he couldn't handle them. But in the deeply superstitious world of 17th century Spain, they didn't see a genetic tragedy. They saw the devil's work. The king wasn't sick, he was bewitched. El hechizado. This idea wasn't just a rumor among the peasants. The court, and even Charles himself, believed he was the victim of a demonic curse. And that belief led to some of the most horrifying moments of his life. Desperate for a cure that doctors couldn't provide, they turned to the church. Priests performed one exorcism after another on the young king. These weren't gentle prayers. They were brutal, terrifying rituals. One exorcist declared Charles was possessed because of a spell cast in a cup of chocolate he drank years ago. The potion, he claimed, had the dissolved brains of a dead man in it to destroy his mind. Charles was tied to his bed while priests chanted and threw holy water on him. In one of the most bizarre and macabre attempts at a cure, he was forced to sleep next to the dug-up, rotting corpses of his ancestors in the royal crypt, hoping their holy presence would drive out the demons. Of course, all this did was terrify the already fragile king. And through all this personal hell, the kingdom demanded one thing from him: an heir. The survival of the entire dynasty was on him. At 18, he was married to a beautiful French princess, Marie-Louise of Orleans. For 10 years, everyone prayed for a child. Charles truly loved his wife, but his body, destroyed by genetic defects, was impotent. He couldn't father a child. His wife, who got the blame for their childless marriage, died tragically in 1689. So, they immediately found him a new bride, Maria Anna of Neuburg, from a German family famous for having lots of kids. The pressure was insane, but the result was the same: no heir. With each passing year, as Charles's health crumbled in front of everyone, the question of who would take the throne after him grew from a palace whisper to a full-blown European crisis. By the last few years of the 1600s, the royal palace in Madrid had become the focus of all of Europe's plotting and scheming. Charles II was basically a living ghost. He was often bedridden, suffering from fainting spells, violent epileptic seizures, and a condition called edema that left his body grotesquely swollen. He was going blind, and his mind was wandering. Everyone knew the end was near. The vultures were circling. Two great powers were ready to tear the Spanish Empire apart. On one side, you had France, led by the Sun King, Louis XIV. His wife was Charles II's half-sister, which gave his grandson, Philip of Anjou, a strong claim to the throne. A French king on the Spanish throne would create a superpower that would completely dominate Europe. On the other side, you had the Austrian Habsburgs, led by Holy Roman Emperor Leopold I. He was Charles's first cousin. His younger son, Archduke Charles, represented keeping the crown in the family. Leopold and his allies, mainly England and the Dutch Republic, were terrified of France getting that powerful. The Spanish court split into pro-French and pro-Austrian camps. Madrid was crawling with ambassadors who were basically spies, bribing courtiers, spreading rumors, and trying to manipulate a king who was barely lucid. Charles himself was just a pawn in this huge game. Confused, exhausted, and in constant pain, he was being pushed and pulled from every direction. At one point, a compromise was worked out to give the crown to a neutral candidate, a young Bavarian prince. Charles, in a rare moment of anger at the thought of his empire being carved up, actually signed a will naming the boy his heir. But then, in 1699, the prince suddenly died of smallpox. The crisis was back on, and worse than ever. The final months of 1700 were a grotesque circus. As Charles lay dying, the fight for his will became desperate. Priests and nobles shuffled in and out of his bedroom. The leader of the pro-French faction, Cardinal Portocarrero, allegedly got to the king last. He and the king's confessor hammered away at Charles, convincing him that only a French successor could keep the empire in one piece. Finally, on October 2nd, 1700, a month before he died, the broken king was convinced to sign a new will. Its contents were a closely guarded secret. The tension across Europe was suffocating. What had he done? Who did he name? On November 1st, 1700, Charles II's tormented body finally gave out. His last words were reportedly, "I am nothing anymore." But before the will could be read, the physicians began their work. They had been given an order almost unheard of for a Spanish king: perform a full autopsy. The court, and all of Europe, needed to know what curse had plagued him. What they found was far more real and far more terrible than any demon. The autopsy happened on November 3rd, 1700. The lead physician, Dr. Pedro Manuel de Arevalo, and his team gathered in a cold room in the palace. The king's body, which once ruled half the world, now lay still on a stone slab. The report they wrote became one of the most infamous documents in medical history, a description so shocking it reads like something out of a horror novel. They started their work. Their report made the sensational claim that the body did not contain a single drop of blood. Now, that's literally impossible, but the dramatic statement tells you just how bad his circulatory system must have been. It set the tone for what was to come. They moved to his head. When they opened his skull, they found it was full of water. This is a clear description of severe hydrocephalus. All that fluid pressing on his brain would explain his abnormally large head, his developmental delays, his cognitive struggles, and the seizures that tormented him. It's a miracle he could function at all. Next, they opened his chest. His lungs were described as corroded, as if eaten away by acid. This points to a lifetime of severe respiratory infections, maybe tuberculosis, that left his lungs scarred and barely working. Every single breath must have been a painful struggle. But the most shocking discovery in his torso was his heart. The report says it was the size of a peppercorn. Again, that's not literal, but the image is unforgettable. It suggests his heart was shrunken and incredibly weak. It's a wonder it could pump blood at all. Then, they moved to his abdomen. His intestines were rotten and gangrenous. This was the source of his chronic digestive problems, the constant pain and diarrhea. The tissue of his gut was literally dying and rotting inside him. They found his kidneys. Or rather, his kidney. He likely only had one to begin with, and it was ravaged by disease, with 3 large stones inside it. Modern science suggests he had a genetic kidney disease that prevents the blood from being cleaned properly, which would cause even more problems, like his rickets and the kidney stones. Finally, the physicians looked at the organs that held the key to the entire crisis: his reproductive organs. The report states that Charles II had only a single testicle, and it was black as coal. The blackness meant it was necrotic. The tissue was dead. This was the final, grim proof. He was sterile. He was physically incapable of producing an heir. The Hapsburg line in Spain hadn't just failed, it had been biologically erased. The autopsy was done. The doctors had their answers. There was no curse. There was no witchcraft. The demon that had tormented Charles II his whole life was genetic. What they had documented, organ by horrifying organ, was the final bill for his ancestry. The water in his brain, the corroded lungs, the shrunken heart, the rotten gut, the dead testicle, they weren't separate illnesses. They were all symptoms of one single, catastrophic failure caused by a fatally flawed genetic blueprint. The autopsy didn't just explain his death, it explained his entire miserable life. The secret was out, and Europe was about to go to war. With the gruesome autopsy over, the final scene of Charles's life could play out. The sealed will was opened. It named Philip, Duke of Anjou, Louis XIV's grandson, as the sole heir to the entire Spanish Empire. When the news reached France, Louis XIV is said to have presented his grandson to the court and declared, "Gentlemen, behold the King of Spain," followed by the famous line, "There are no more Pyrenees." The mountains that separated France and Spain had, politically, just been erased. The dream of a Bourbon superstate was now a reality. The rest of Europe basically panicked. Emperor Leopold in Vienna was furious, but the real fear was in London and The Hague. For maritime powers like England and the Dutch Republic, a united France and Spain was an existential threat. It would shatter the balance of power, give France total control of the continent, and cut them off from valuable trade routes. War wasn't just likely, it was a sure thing. In 1701, England, the Dutch Republic, and the Holy Roman Empire formed the Grand Alliance against France. The goal? Put their guy, the Austrian Archduke Charles, on the Spanish throne. The conflict that erupted was the War of the Spanish Succession. It lasted for 13 brutal years, from 1701 to 1714, and is sometimes called the First Real World War. Fighting raged across Europe, in North America, and in the Caribbean. Hundreds of thousands of people died. Spain itself was torn apart by a civil war between supporters of the French Philip and the Austrian Charles. And then, in a twist of fate, the very thing the alliance was fighting to prevent is what ended the war. In 1711, the Holy Roman Emperor died, and their candidate, Archduke Charles, inherited the Austrian Empire. Suddenly, the Allies faced the prospect of recreating the old, massive Hapsburg Empire of the 16th century. A super-powerful Austria was just as scary as a super-powerful France. With the whole reason for fighting gone, peace talks began. The result was the Treaty of Utrecht. Philip V was confirmed as King of Spain, and his Bourbon dynasty still rules today. But he had to renounce any claim to the French throne, keeping the two kingdoms separate. The Spanish Empire was carved up. Spain lost its territories in Italy and the Netherlands to Austria, and gave Gibraltar and Minorca to Great Britain, a strategic prize they still hold. The war was over. The autopsy of one man had started a conflict that killed nearly 1 million. The map of Europe was redrawn, and the centuries-long reign of the Habsburgs in Spain was finished, all because of a secret hidden in the blood. The story of Charles II is a wild reminder of how the personal, and even biological, lives of people in the past can have world-changing consequences. History is filled with these dark, strange, and fascinating stories that show you the truth behind the big events. If you enjoyed this deep dive into the grotesque end of a dynasty, make sure you hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell. You don't want to miss our next trip into the shadows of history. And we want to hear from you. What other historical figures had a secret that changed everything? Let us know down in the comments. So what do we make of Charles II? He's often remembered as a failure, a symbol of decay, the pathetic end of a mighty family. And sure, his reign saw Spain's power continue to fade. But it's also true that he was a man who never, ever had a chance. He wasn't a villain. He was a victim, a human sacrifice on the altar of his family's ambition. His body was the canvas where the sins of his ancestors were painted in the most horrifying colors. The findings of his autopsy became a legend across Europe, a powerful cautionary tale about the arrogance of power. It was the ultimate proof that even the most powerful bloodline on earth can't defy biology forever. Charles II ruled for 35 years, but his real impact on history came in his death. His childless, broken body was the spark that plunged a continent into war and created a new world order. The fall of the Habsburgs in Spain, the rise of the Bourbons, the decline of Spanish power, and the rise of Britain and France. You can trace all of it back to the secrets found by his physicians on that stone slab. The story of the Bewitched King is more than just a macabre medical mystery. It shows how the tiny threads of DNA can get tangled up in the grand tapestry of empires, and how the secrets inside a single person can unravel a dynasty and reshape the world.